The fishing boat rocked gently in Portland Harbor as 28-year-old Derek Cobb opened the hidden compartment beneath the captain's chair, and what he found inside made his blood run cold. A child's pink ribbon, yellowed photographs, and a leather journal that would unravel a 51-year-old mystery that had haunted the coastal town of Pemaquid Point since the summer of 1973. His grandfather, the respected fisherman Lawrence Patrick Cobb, had taken a terrible secret to his grave just 6 months earlier, but the truth was about to surface in the most unexpected way. The evidence had been preserved perfectly, waiting in darkness for over 5 decades, and it would finally bring justice to a little girl who never came home from the beach. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning of August 14th, 1973, began like any other summer day along the rocky shores of Maine. The sun rose over Lighthouse Beach with that particular golden quality that made tourists reach for their cameras and locals pause to appreciate the beauty they sometimes took for granted. 5-year-old Evelyn Conway was practically vibrating with excitement as her mother, Patricia Conway, packed their beach bag with sandwiches, juice boxes, and the red plastic bucket and shovel that Evelyn had received for her birthday just 2 weeks earlier. The little girl's blonde curls bounced as she jumped up and down in the kitchen of their modest cottage on Spruce Lane, begging her mother to hurry up so they could get to the beach before all the good shells were taken by other collectors. Patricia smiled at her daughter's enthusiasm, tucking an extra towel into the bag while her husband, Robert Conway, loaded their station wagon with the cooler and umbrella. Robert worked as an accountant at the lumber mill in New Harbor, and this was one of his rare days off during the busy summer season. He had promised Evelyn they would build the biggest sandcastle Lighthouse Beach had ever seen, complete with a moat and towers and flags made from sticks and seaweed. The Conway family was tight-knit and loving, the kind of family that neighbors pointed to as an example of wholesome American values in that era of social upheaval and changing traditions. They arrived at Lighthouse Beach around 9:30 in the morning, parking their wood-paneled station wagon in the small gravel lot near the iconic Pemaquid Point Lighthouse that had been guiding ships to safety since 1827. The lighthouse stood proud and white against the blue sky, its black gallery and lantern room visible for miles in every direction. Patricia spread their blanket on a flat stretch of sand about 50 yards from the water's edge, positioning it so she could keep an eye on Evelyn, while also enjoying the view of the lighthouse and the waves crashing against the ancient ledges that made this stretch of coast so distinctive and dangerous. Evelyn didn't waste any time. She grabbed her red bucket and took off toward the waterline, her little legs pumping as fast as they could carry her across the warm sand. Patricia called after her to stay where they could see her, and Evelyn waved enthusiastically to show she understood, though her attention was already focused on the treasures she might find among the rocks and tide pools. Robert followed at a more leisurely pace, carrying his tackle box because he thought he might try his hand at fishing from the rocks if the opportunity presented itself. The beach was moderately crowded that morning, with perhaps 20 or 30 other visitors scattered across the shoreline, families mostly, along with a few solitary beachcombers and the occasional photographer trying to capture the perfect shot of the lighthouse. Down by the water, Lawrence Patrick Cobb was preparing his fishing boat for a day on the ocean. At 53 years old, Lawrence was a fixture in the Pemaquid Point community, a third-generation fisherman who knew every rock, current, and fishing spot within 20 miles of the coast. His weathered face and calloused hands spoke of decades spent battling the elements, and his reputation for honesty and hard work had earned him the respect of everyone in town. He lived alone in a small house on Harbor Road, his wife having passed away from cancer 3 years earlier, leaving him childless and increasingly isolated, despite his friendly demeanor and willingness to help neighbors with whatever they needed. Lawrence had noticed the Conway family when they arrived, as he noticed most things that happened on his stretch of beach. He had a particular way of observing people without seeming to stare, a skill developed over years of watching weather patterns and reading the ocean's moods. He saw the little blonde girl racing toward the water and smiled slightly, remembering when he had been young enough to find such pure joy in simple pleasures. His own childhood had been happy enough, though tinged with the hardship that came from growing up in a fishing family during the Depression years. He secured the last line on his boat and glanced at his watch, calculating the tides and deciding he had another 30 minutes before he needed to head out to check his lobster traps. Evelyn was in heaven. The tide had just started to recede, leaving behind dozens of tide pools filled with tiny crabs, periwinkles, and the occasional starfish clinging to the rocks. She crouched beside one particularly promising pool and peered into the crystal-clear water, watching a hermit crab scuttle across the sandy bottom. Her bucket already contained 3 perfect shells, a smooth piece of sea glass in a milky white color, and a small piece of driftwood that looked like it might be shaped like a dolphin if you squinted and used your imagination. She could hear her father calling to her from somewhere behind, asking if she wanted help reaching the shells on the higher rocks, but she was determined to do this herself, to prove she was a big girl who didn't need constant supervision. Patricia Conway had settled into her beach chair with a paperback novel, one of those romance stories with a shirtless man on the cover that her husband teased her about but that she secretly loved. She glanced up every few minutes to check on Evelyn, seeing the bright pink swimsuit moving among the rocks, occasionally bending down to examine something interesting. Robert had wandered further down the beach, greeting some acquaintances from town and stopping to chat about the upcoming Labor Day picnic that the community center was planning. The morning stretched out peacefully, the kind of perfect summer day that people would remember fondly in the dark depths of winter. At 10:45, Patricia looked up from her book and realized she couldn't immediately spot Evelyn's pink swimsuit among the rocks. She felt a small flutter of concern, but told herself not to be one of those overprotective mothers who couldn't let their children explore and learn independence. She stood up, shading her eyes against the sun, scanning the beach more carefully. The tide was coming in now, and the rocks where Evelyn had been playing were becoming obscured by waves. Patricia called out her daughter's name, trying to keep the worry out of her voice, not wanting to cause a scene if Evelyn was simply hidden behind a larger boulder, or had wandered a bit further than usual. Robert heard his wife calling and jogged back toward their blanket, his expression shifting from relaxed to concerned as he registered the tension in Patricia's voice. They both started calling for Evelyn, their voices becoming more urgent with each unanswered cry. Other beachgoers began to notice the commotion, and within minutes a dozen people had joined the search, spreading out across the beach and checking behind rocks, in tide pools, calling the little girl's name over and over. The joyful atmosphere of the morning evaporated, replaced by the cold fear that every parent dreads, the nightmare scenario that transforms a perfect day into every family's worst tragedy. Lawrence Cobb had been coiling rope on his boat when he heard the first shouts. He looked up and saw the growing crowd, heard the panic in the voices carrying across the water. He secured his boat quickly and walked up the beach toward the commotion, his weathered face creased with concern. When he reached the Conways and learned that a 5-year-old girl was missing, he immediately offered to help search, his knowledge of the coastline making him particularly valuable in checking the dangerous areas where rocks and currents could trap or injure someone. He spent the next hour methodically searching every crevice, every pool, every possible place where a small child might have fallen or become stuck. By noon, the local police had been called. Chief Harold Brennan arrived with 2 officers, and within 30 minutes the beach had been transformed into a command center. More volunteers arrived from town, people who had heard about the missing girl through the rapid-fire gossip network that small communities excel at. The Coast Guard was notified, and boats began searching the waters offshore, though everyone hoped desperately that it wouldn't come to that Evelyn would be found safe somewhere on land, perhaps having wandered off and gotten lost or fallen asleep in some hidden spot. Patricia Conway was nearly hysterical, being comforted by several women from the community, while Robert gave a detailed description of his daughter to Chief Brennan, his voice shaking as he described her blonde curls, her pink swimsuit, her red bucket that had been found abandoned near the tide pools. The search continued throughout the afternoon and into the evening. Flashlights bobbed along the beach as darkness fell, and someone brought in searchlights powered by generators to illuminate the area. Helicopters from the state police joined the effort, their spotlights sweeping across the water and the rocky coastline. News crews arrived from Portland and Bangor, their cameras capturing the anguished faces of the Conways and the grim determination of the searchers. By midnight, when Evelyn had been missing for over 12 hours, Chief Brennan had to acknowledge the terrible truth that everyone was thinking, but nobody wanted to say out loud. This was no longer a rescue operation, but a recovery mission, and the chances of finding Evelyn Conway alive were diminishing with each passing hour. Lawrence Cobb was among the last volunteers to leave the beach that night. He had searched until his legs ached and his voice was hoarse from calling Evelyn's name. Chief Brennan thanked him personally for his efforts, and Lawrence nodded solemnly, saying he would be back at first light to continue searching. He walked slowly back to his boat, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion and sorrow. He sat in the captain's chair for a long time, staring out at the dark water, listening to the waves and thinking about the cruel randomness of tragedy, how a perfect summer day could turn into a nightmare in the span of minutes. The search for Evelyn Conway continued for 2 weeks, becoming one of the most intensive missing person investigations in Maine's history up to that point. The FBI was called in, bringing their expertise and resources to bear on the case. Every registered sex offender within 100 miles was questioned and their alibis checked. Divers searched the waters around Lighthouse Beach repeatedly, combing the ocean floor for any sign of the little girl. Cadaver dogs were brought in from Boston, trained German shepherds that could detect human remains even in challenging conditions. They alerted on several spots along the beach, but each time the searchers found nothing, just old bones from animals or fish that had decomposed in the sand. The investigation focused heavily on interviewing everyone who had been at the beach that morning. Chief Brennan and his team, working alongside FBI Special Agent Margaret Dalton, compiled a list of over 40 people who had been present around the time of Evelyn's disappearance. Each person was interviewed multiple times, their stories checked and rechecked for inconsistencies. The process was exhaustive and often frustrating, as memories proved unreliable, and witnesses contradicted each other on seemingly basic details, like what time certain people arrived or left the beach. Lawrence Cobb was interviewed 3 times during the first week of the investigation. His story never varied. He had been preparing his boat for fishing, had seen the Conway family arrive, had noticed the little girl playing near the tide pools, but had not paid particular attention to her. When he heard the commotion about a missing child, he had immediately joined the search. He had seen nothing suspicious, no strangers lurking around, no unusual vehicles in the parking lot, no one paying inappropriate attention to children. Agent Dalton found his answers consistent and straightforward, and his reputation in the community was impeccable. Several people vouched for his character, describing him as a hard-working, honest man who kept to himself, but was always willing to lend a hand when needed. The FBI investigation eventually expanded beyond the beach to explore other theories. Had Evelyn been abducted by someone passing through the area? Perhaps someone who had specifically targeted the beach, knowing it would have children present that summer day? Had she wandered into the water and been swept away by a rogue wave, her small body carried far out to sea where it might never be recovered? Could she have climbed into a vehicle in the parking lot, perhaps thinking she recognized someone, or lured by promises of candy or a puppy? Every possibility was examined, every lead followed, no matter how tenuous or unlikely. Robert and Patricia Conway aged years in a matter of weeks. The vibrant young couple who had arrived at the beach that morning were transformed into haunted, hollow-eyed parents who couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't function beyond the basic necessities of staying alive and waiting for news about their daughter. Their modest cottage on Spruce Lane became a headquarters of sorts, always filled with law enforcement officers, volunteers, and well-meaning neighbors bringing casseroles and offers of support. Patricia refused to let anyone touch Evelyn's room, keeping it exactly as it had been the morning they left for the beach, as if maintaining this shrine might somehow bring her daughter back home. By September, as the leaves began to turn and the summer tourists returned to their regular lives, the active search for Evelyn Conway had been scaled back dramatically. Chief Brennan held a press conference where he acknowledged that without new leads or evidence, there was little more the local police could do. The case would remain open indefinitely, he assured the gathered reporters and the heartbroken Conway family, and any new information would be investigated immediately. Agent Dalton returned to her office in Boston, though she left her contact information with the Conways and told them to call anytime, day or night, if they needed anything or if any developments occurred. The case became one of those mysteries that communities never quite forget, the kind of tragedy that gets referenced decades later when parents warn their children to stay close at the beach, to never wander off, to remember what happened to that little Conway girl back in '73. For years afterward, every summer would bring renewed media attention, anniversary stories about the unsolved disappearance, updates that usually amounted to saying nothing had changed and Evelyn was still missing. The Lighthouse Beach tragedy became part of the local folklore, a cautionary tale, and a reminder that bad things could happen anywhere, even in idyllic coastal towns where everyone knew everyone, and crime was supposed to be limited to occasional vandalism and underage drinking. Lawrence Cobb continued his fishing routine, going out on the water most days, checking his traps, selling his catch at the docks. He attended the community memorial service that was held for Evelyn 6 months after her disappearance, standing quietly in the back of the Episcopal Church, while the minister talked about God's mysterious ways and the importance of keeping hope alive, even in the darkest times. Lawrence contributed $20 to the reward fund that had been established, money that eventually grew to over $15,000 as people from across Maine and beyond sent in contributions, hoping to incentivize someone with information to come forward. But nobody came forward. The leads dried up. The phone calls to the tip line became less frequent, and eventually the investigation settled into that twilight state of being technically open but practically dormant. Robert Conway threw himself into his work at the lumber mill, taking every overtime shift available, staying busy so he wouldn't have to think about the daughter-sized hole in his life. Patricia never fully recovered, developing anxiety and depression that would plague her for the rest of her life, medicated and manageable, but always there, a shadow that never quite lifted. They never had another child, though not for lack of trying in the first few years after Evelyn's disappearance. It was as if their capacity for hope had been broken, their faith in happy endings shattered beyond repair. The years rolled on, as years do regardless of human tragedy. The 1970s gave way to the 80s, then the 90s, then the new millennium. Technology advanced, investigative techniques improved, DNA analysis became routine. Cold cases across the country were being reopened and solved with new forensic methods, but the Evelyn Conway case remained frustratingly static. There was no body to analyze, no physical evidence to test, nothing but old witness statements and faded photographs of a smiling little girl who had vanished into thin air on a beautiful August morning. Lawrence Cobb aged along with the case. His dark hair turned gray, then white. His weathered face developed deeper creases and lines. He sold his fishing boat in the early 2000s, retiring after 50-plus years on the water, his body finally giving in to the accumulated wear and tear of a lifetime of physical labor. He moved from his house on Harbor Road to a small apartment in a senior living complex in New Harbor, bringing with him only the essentials and a few treasured possessions, including photographs of his late wife and some old fishing gear that held sentimental value. His grandson, Derek Cobb, visited him regularly during those retirement years. Derek was the son of Lawrence's only nephew, raised in Portland but maintaining close ties to the Pemaquid Point area, where his family had deep roots. Derek had followed in the family tradition and worked as a marine mechanic, specializing in boat engines and electrical systems. He had always admired his grandfather, listening for hours to Lawrence's stories about the old days of fishing, the storms he had weathered, the abundant catches in the lean years, the characters he had known during his decades on the water. Lawrence passed away peacefully in his sleep on February 3rd, 2024, at the age of 104. He had lived an extraordinarily long life, outliving most of his contemporaries and remaining relatively healthy and mentally sharp until nearly the end. Derek was named executor of his grandfather's modest estate, which consisted mainly of some savings bonds, the contents of his apartment, and his old fishing boat, which had been in storage at a marina in Portland. Lawrence had kept the boat even after retiring, unable to quite let go of that connection to his life's work, and he had left specific instructions in his will that the boat should go to Derek if Derek wanted it. Derek did want it. The boat was a 32-foot lobster boat named the Patricia Rose, built in 1967 and maintained meticulously throughout its decades of service. Derek had always loved that boat, had gone out on it numerous times as a teenager, learning navigation and seamanship from his grandfather. He made arrangements to have the Patricia Rose moved to a slip he rented at a marina closer to his home in Portland, planning to restore her to full working condition as a way of honoring Lawrence's memory and maintaining that tangible link to his family's heritage. On March 15, 2024, Derek spent his first full day aboard the Patricia Rose since his grandfather's death. He was doing a thorough inspection of all the boat's systems, checking the engine, the electrical wiring, the hull for any damage or deterioration. He was in the wheelhouse, examining the captain's chair which Lawrence had special ordered back in the 70s, when he noticed something odd. The chair's base seemed thicker than necessary, and when Derek pressed on it experimentally, he felt something give slightly. He grabbed a flashlight and examined the base more carefully, discovering that what he had assumed was solid construction was actually a false bottom, a hidden compartment that had been cleverly concealed. His heart began to pound as he worked to open the compartment, using a screwdriver to carefully pry up the false bottom. The compartment was about 18 inches square and perhaps 6 inches deep, lined with what appeared to be waterproof material. Inside, Derek found a sealed plastic container, the heavy-duty kind used for long-term storage. His hands shook slightly as he pulled the container out and set it on the deck, staring at it for a long moment before working up the courage to open it. Inside the container, preserved as if they had been placed there yesterday, were items that made Derek's breath catch in his throat. A child's pink hair ribbon, the fabric faded but still intact, a small red plastic beach bucket with a crack down one side, several photographs, some showing a little blonde girl playing on a beach, others showing Lawrence Cobb himself in various locations, and a series of disturbing images that Derek's brain initially refused to process. And beneath it all, a leather-bound journal filled with handwritten entries in his grandfather's distinctive script. Derek sat down heavily, his legs suddenly unable to support him. He picked up the journal with trembling hands and opened it to the first page, where he found an entry dated August 14th, 1973. The words swam before his eyes as he read his grandfather's confession, written in calm, methodical detail, explaining exactly what had happened to Evelyn Marie Conway on that terrible summer day, 51 years ago. The journal entries painted a picture that Derek could barely comprehend, could barely reconcile with the kind, gentle grandfather he had known and loved. Lawrence wrote about his loneliness after his wife's death, about the darkness that had been growing inside him, about the urges he had fought against but ultimately surrendered to. He wrote about watching Evelyn that morning, about waiting for the perfect moment when she wandered further from her parents than usual, about luring her to his boat with promises of showing her something special, a baby seal that he claimed was swimming just off the rocks. The details were horrifying and precise. Lawrence described how trusting Evelyn had been, how easily she had followed him, how her confusion had turned to fear only when they were already far from shore and it was too late for her to cry out for help. He wrote about taking her to a small, uninhabited island about 3 miles offshore, a place he knew from decades of fishing, a place where no one would think to search because it was just bare rock and scrub brush with nothing to attract visitors. He described what he had done there, and Derek had to put the journal down several times, fighting waves of nausea and horror as he read his grandfather's matter-of-fact accounting of actions too terrible to fully process. The journal explained how Lawrence had left Evelyn's body in a deep crevice on the island, covering it with rocks in a way that would make it nearly impossible to find, even if searchers somehow made it to that location. He had taken the hair ribbon and the bucket as souvenirs, along with the photographs he had taken both before and after. He wrote about returning to the beach, joining the search efforts, being interviewed by police, and maintaining his composure throughout, playing the role of concerned community member while knowing exactly what had happened to the little girl everyone was desperately seeking. The later entries in the journal detailed Lawrence's internal struggle with what he had done. There were passages of remorse, of self-loathing, of wishes that he could undo his actions and bring Evelyn back to her grieving parents. But there were also passages that revealed a darker psychology, a satisfaction in having gotten away with the crime, a pride in his ability to deceive everyone around him. He wrote about attending the memorial service, about seeing Robert and Patricia Conway destroyed by grief, about feeling both guilt and a strange sense of power, knowing he held the secret to their suffering. Derek read through the entire journal in a state of shock, his worldview crumbling with each turn of the page. The grandfather he had loved, the man he had respected and admired, had been a monster hiding behind a mask of respectability. Every memory was now tainted, every moment they had shared together poisoned by this revelation. Derek thought about all the times Lawrence had talked about the importance of honesty and hard work, about being a good member of the community, about treating others with kindness and respect. It had all been lies, or at least a profound hypocrisy that Derek couldn't begin to understand. The photographs were even worse than the journal in some ways. There were innocent pictures of Evelyn playing on the beach that Lawrence must have taken before approaching her, surreptitious shots that showed his planning and premeditation. Then there were the pictures from the island, images that Derek could barely look at, evidence of crimes so heinous that he felt physically ill. His grandfather had documented everything, had created a record of his actions that Derek now held in his shaking hands. For several hours, Derek sat alone on that boat, paralyzed by indecision and horror. Part of him wanted to throw everything overboard, to sink it in the deepest part of the harbor and pretend he had never found it, to protect his grandfather's memory and his family's reputation. But another part of him, the part that ultimately won out, knew that this wasn't about Lawrence Cobb or the Cobb family reputation. This was about Evelyn Conway, about a 5-year-old girl who had deserved to live a full life but had been robbed of that chance. This was about Robert and Patricia Conway, now in their 80s if they were still alive, who had spent 51 years not knowing what happened to their daughter. Derek carefully repacked everything in the container, sealing it exactly as he had found it. He locked the boat and drove directly to the Portland Police Department, asking to speak with someone in the detective division. The desk sergeant, seeing something in Derek's expression that indicated this was serious, called up Detective Sarah Rodriguez, a 15-year veteran who specialized in cold cases among her other duties. Derek was shown to an interview room where he sat clutching the container to his chest until Detective Rodriguez arrived. What followed was one of the most emotionally draining experiences of Derek's life. He explained who he was, who his grandfather had been, and what he had discovered aboard the boat. Detective Rodriguez's expression shifted from curious to shocked as Derek opened the container and revealed its contents. She immediately called for backup, for her supervisor, for the crime scene technicians who would need to document and process this evidence. Within an hour, the interview room was crowded with law enforcement personnel, all of them staring in disbelief at the artifacts from a 51-year-old crime that had just been handed to them on a silver platter. The news spread quickly through law enforcement channels. The Maine State Police were notified, and they in turn contacted the FBI since the original investigation had involved federal agents. By that evening, a full task force had been assembled to verify Derek's discovery and determine how to proceed. The journal entries were photographed and transcribed, with multiple experts comparing the handwriting to known samples of Lawrence Cobb's writing. The photographs were analyzed by forensic specialists who confirmed they had been taken with the type of camera Lawrence was known to have owned in the 1970s. The hair ribbon and bucket were tested for DNA, though everyone knew that modern forensic techniques might not yield much from evidence that had been sealed away for half a century. Detective Rodriguez had the difficult task of locating and informing Robert and Patricia Conway. After some research, she learned that Patricia had passed away in 2017 from complications related to Alzheimer's disease, never knowing what had happened to her daughter. Robert, however, was still alive at age 86, living in an assisted living facility in Bath, Maine. Detective Rodriguez drove out to see him personally the next morning, bringing with her a victim advocate and preparing herself for one of the most challenging notifications of her career. Robert Conway had never stopped hoping for answers, even as the decades passed and hope became increasingly difficult to maintain. When Detective Rodriguez introduced herself and explained that there had been a major development in Evelyn's case, he began to weep before she could even tell him the details. He had waited 51 years for this moment, had endured 5 decades of not knowing, of wondering every single day what had happened to his little girl. Learning the truth was both devastating and oddly relieving, the confirmation of his worst fears, but also the end of the terrible uncertainty that had defined his adult life. Detective Rodriguez showed him the photographs of Evelyn playing on the beach, the innocent ones taken before Lawrence had approached her, and Robert's gnarled fingers traced the outline of his daughter's face on the printouts, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. He wanted to know everything, needed to understand exactly what had happened, and Rodriguez gave him as much information as she ethically could, while sparing him the most disturbing details. She told him about Derek Cobb discovering the hidden compartment, about the journal that contained Lawrence's confession, about the evidence that proved beyond any doubt what had happened to Evelyn and who was responsible. The story broke in the media 2 days later, and it became a national sensation. Major news networks covered the case extensively, fascinated by the dramatic discovery and the resolution of a mystery that had spanned 5 decades. Reporters descended on Pemaquid Point, interviewing longtime residents who remembered the original search for Evelyn and were now learning the shocking truth about Lawrence Cobb. Many people who had known Lawrence expressed disbelief, unable to reconcile the helpful fisherman they had known with the monster who had committed such heinous crimes. Others, looking back through the lens of this new knowledge, claimed they had always sensed something off about him, though these claims were likely influenced by hindsight bias rather than actual suspicion at the time. Derek Cobb found himself at the center of an unwanted media storm. Reporters camped outside his home, eager for interviews and comments about his grandfather and the discovery. Derek refused most requests, giving only one carefully prepared statement through an attorney in which he expressed his horror at what Lawrence had done, his sympathy for the Conway family, and his gratitude that the truth had finally come to light. He emphasized that he had immediately contacted police upon discovering the evidence, that he had never had any suspicion about his grandfather's involvement in Evelyn's disappearance, and that he hoped the resolution of this case might bring some measure of closure to all those affected by the tragedy. The legal questions surrounding the case were complex and ultimately academic, since Lawrence Cobb was dead and beyond the reach of earthly justice. Prosecutors reviewed all the evidence and concluded that had Lawrence still been alive, the journal and physical evidence would have been more than sufficient to charge and convict him of kidnapping, murder, and related crimes. The FBI announced that they were closing the Evelyn Conway case as solved, with Lawrence Patrick Cobb identified as the sole perpetrator. They also began a comprehensive review of other cold cases from the Maine coastal area during the years Lawrence had been active, looking for any possible connection to other unsolved disappearances or crimes. The Maine State Police organized an expedition to the island that Lawrence had described in his journal. Using GPS coordinates and detailed descriptions from the journal entries, they located the spot where Lawrence claimed to have left Evelyn's body. The search team included forensic anthropologists, crime scene technicians, and cadaver dogs. After 2 days of careful excavation in the rocky crevice, they found skeletal remains that were later confirmed through DNA comparison with Robert Conway to be those of Evelyn Marie Conway. The discovery of Evelyn's remains allowed for a proper burial, something Robert had never thought he would be able to provide. A private funeral service was held at the same Episcopal church where the memorial had been conducted 51 years earlier. Robert sat in the front pew, supported by cousins and a few remaining friends, as the minister spoke words of comfort and spoke about how Evelyn could now finally rest in peace. She was buried beside her mother in the Pemaquid Point Cemetery, her gravestone reading simply, Evelyn Marie Conway, beloved daughter, born April 26, 1968, died August 14, 1973, finally home. Robert Conway lived for another 8 months after Evelyn's funeral, passing away peacefully in his sleep in November 2024. Those who cared for him in his final months said that knowing the truth about what had happened to Evelyn seemed to give him permission to let go, to end his long vigil and join his wife and daughter. His obituary mentioned that he was preceded in death by his beloved daughter Evelyn, whose case had recently been solved after 5 decades, and that he had spent his final months at peace, knowing she had been found and laid to rest with dignity. The Evelyn Conway case became a reference point in discussions about cold cases, evidence preservation, and the importance of never giving up on seeking justice for victims. Law enforcement agencies across the country studied the case, using it as an example in training sessions about how unexpected breakthroughs can occur decades after a crime, how evidence can be found in the most unlikely places, and how advances in forensic science and investigative techniques can solve cases that seemed permanently closed. Derek Cobb's decision to immediately contact police rather than trying to conceal what he had found was held up as an example of moral courage, choosing to do the right thing even when it meant destroying his grandfather's reputation and exposing his family to public scrutiny and shame. The hidden compartment in the Patricia Rose was examined extensively by criminal profilers and forensic psychologists trying to understand Lawrence Cobb's psychology. The care he had taken to preserve the evidence, the detailed journal entries, the photographs, all suggested a complex psychological profile, Some experts theorized that Lawrence had kept these items as trophies, a way to relive his crimes and maintain a sense of power and control. Others suggested that the preservation might indicate some level of unconscious desire to eventually be caught, a need for his actions to be acknowledged, even if he couldn't bring himself to confess while alive. The journal entries themselves provided insight into the mind of someone capable of committing such heinous acts, while maintaining a facade of normalcy for decades. The case also raised uncomfortable questions about how well people really know each other, how monsters can hide in plain sight behind masks of respectability, and how communities need to remain vigilant even in places where serious crime seems unlikely. Lawrence Cobb had been a trusted member of the Pemaquid Point community for over 50 years, someone people looked up to and respected. Yet he had been harboring a terrible secret the entire time. It was a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself, doesn't always look like what people expect it to look like. For Derek Cobb, the aftermath of his discovery was a long and difficult journey. He sold the Patricia Rose, unable to imagine ever setting foot on the boat again after what he had found there. He went through intensive therapy to process his feelings about his grandfather, working through the cognitive dissonance of reconciling the loving family member he had known with the monster who had committed such terrible crimes. He struggled with guilt, wondering if there had been signs he should have noticed, clues he should have picked up on, though his therapist repeatedly assured him that Lawrence had been skilled at compartmentalization and deception, that there was no way Derek could have known. The Pemaquid Point community was also forced to reckon with the revelation that one of their own had been responsible for the tragedy that had haunted them for 5 decades. The house where Lawrence had lived on Harbor Road before moving to the senior complex was marked with graffiti and vandalism, forcing the current owners, who had nothing to do with Lawrence, to consider selling and moving. The section of Lighthouse Beach where Evelyn had disappeared became a place of pilgrimage, with people leaving flowers, toys, and notes expressing sorrow for what had happened there. The community eventually erected a small memorial plaque near the lighthouse, dedicating it to Evelyn's memory and to all missing children, a permanent reminder of the importance of vigilance and the devastating consequences when trust is betrayed. In the years following the case's resolution, several investigative journalists and true crime authors wrote extensively about the Evelyn Conway tragedy. Books were published examining every aspect of the case, from the initial disappearance through the dramatic discovery of evidence 5 decades later. Documentary filmmakers produced multiple television specials exploring the investigation, interviewing everyone involved from Derek Cobb to Detective Rodriguez to Robert Conway during his final months. The case became one of those landmark stories that people referenced when discussing cold cases and the importance of never giving up hope that justice might eventually prevail. The forensic analysis of the journal and photographs also provided law enforcement with valuable insights that helped solve other cases. Lawrence's methodical documentation of his crimes, while horrifying, gave investigators a window into his thinking and methods. This information was cross-referenced with other unsolved cases from the Maine coastal area during the time period Lawrence had been active as a fisherman. While no definitive links were established to other crimes, several investigations were reopened based on similarities to Lawrence's known methods and the areas where he had operated his fishing boat over the years. Detective Sarah Rodriguez, who had been the first to receive Derek's earth-shattering confession, became something of an expert on the cold case investigations following the Evelyn Conway case. She gave presentations at law enforcement conferences, wrote articles for professional journals, and advocated for increased resources and attention to be devoted to unsolved cases. She emphasized that the Evelyn Conway case demonstrated how justice could prevail even after decades, how families deserved answers no matter how much time had passed, and how investigators should never assume a case was too old to solve. The psychological impact on the Pemaquid Point community took years to fully process. Many longtime residents had to confront the fact that they had socialized with Lawrence Cobb, had accepted help from him, had considered him a friend, never suspecting the darkness he carried inside. Some people felt guilty for not seeing through his facade, though rationally they knew there was no way they could have known. Others felt angry at having been deceived for so long, at having their community's reputation tarnished by association with such terrible crimes. The community held several public forums and healing circles, bringing in counselors and victim advocates to help people process their complicated emotions about the revelations. For the true crime community, the Evelyn Conway case became a touchstone, referenced in countless discussions about famous cold cases and unexpected resolutions. The case had everything that captivated public attention: an innocent victim, a decades-long mystery, a dramatic discovery, and the shocking revelation that the perpetrator had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. Internet sleuths who had worked on the case before its resolution, developing theories and following leads, found themselves vindicated in some ways, but also humbled by how the actual resolution had nothing to do with their online investigations. The truth had been hidden in a boat the entire time, waiting for someone to look in the right place. The story of Evelyn Marie Conway ends both tragically and with a strange sense of completion. A little girl who should have grown up to live a full life was robbed of that chance by someone who betrayed the community's trust in the most devastating way possible. Her parents spent 51 years not knowing what happened to her, living in a kind of limbo that most people cannot imagine. But ultimately, the truth came to light. Justice was served in the court of public opinion, if not in an actual courtroom, and Evelyn was able to be laid to rest with dignity beside her mother. The resolution came too late for Patricia and nearly too late for Robert, but it came nevertheless, proof that some secrets cannot stay hidden forever, and that time does not erase the demand for justice and truth. Derek Cobb's decision to immediately contact authorities when he found the hidden compartment was the crucial moment that brought everything to light. He could have destroyed the evidence, could have protected his family's name and his grandfather's reputation, but instead he chose to honor the memory of Evelyn Conway and give her family the answers they had sought for over 5 decades. It was an act of moral courage that came at personal cost, but it was undoubtedly the right thing to do, and it serves as an example of how ordinary people can make extraordinary choices when faced with difficult situations. The hidden compartment beneath the captain's chair of the Patricia Rose contains secrets that spanned 51 years, evidence that proved beyond doubt what happened on that terrible August day in 1973. The preservation of that evidence, whether through Lawrence's desire to keep trophies or some unconscious need for eventual accountability, meant that Evelyn Conway's story could finally be told completely. The pink hair ribbon, the red bucket, the photographs, and most importantly, the detailed journal entries in Lawrence's own handwriting provided irrefutable proof of his guilt and gave investigators the information they needed to locate and recover Evelyn's remains. In the end, the case of Evelyn Marie Conway stands as a reminder of several important truths. Evil can hide behind ordinary facades. Trusted community members can harbor terrible secrets, and justice sometimes takes decades to manifest, but can ultimately prevail. The case also demonstrates the importance of families never giving up hope for answers, of investigators keeping cases open even when leads dry up, and of individuals like Derek Cobb having the moral courage to do the right thing even when it would be easier to look the other way. Evelyn deserved justice, deserved to be found and laid to rest properly, deserved to have her story told. After 51 years of silence, those things finally happened, and a mystery that had haunted an entire community was finally, definitively solved. The ripple effects of the case's resolution extended far beyond the immediate families involved, touching lives in ways both expected and surprising. The small Episcopal church where both the memorial service and funeral had been held became a gathering place for healing, with Reverend Michael Hastings organizing support groups for community members struggling to process the revelations about Lawrence Cobb. These meetings drew dozens of people in the months following the discovery, some who had known Lawrence personally, others who simply needed a space to discuss their feelings about how someone could maintain such a convincing facade for so many years. The conversations were often difficult and emotional, with participants wrestling with questions about the nature of evil, the reliability of human judgment, and the ways that trauma can echo through generations. Among those most affected by the case's resolution were the volunteer searchers who had spent days and weeks looking for Evelyn back in 1973. Several of these individuals, now in their 70s and 80s, came forward to share their memories with journalists and documentarians. Walter Finnegan, who had been a 32-year-old construction worker when Evelyn disappeared, described the gut-wrenching experience of searching the coastline day after day, calling out her name until his voice was raw, all while the person responsible was searching alongside them. Walter had actually worked with Lawrence on several occasions during the search, with Lawrence suggesting places to look and offering his knowledge of the local geography to help coordinate efforts. The betrayal Walter felt upon learning the truth was profound. A sense that his good faith efforts had been manipulated and mocked by someone playing a sick game. Jennifer Morrison had been just 16 years old in August 1973, a local teenager who had joined the search efforts along with many others from the community. She remembered seeing Lawrence Cobb at the beach on the day of the disappearance, recalled him seeming concerned and helpful as the panic began to spread. Jennifer had always carried a sense of guilt about not having noticed anything unusual, about not somehow preventing what happened. When the truth came out 51 years later, she found herself experiencing a complicated mix of emotions. On one hand, learning that a practiced predator had been responsible relieved some of her irrational guilt. It had not been a matter of people not paying enough attention, but rather someone actively working to deceive them. On the other hand, the revelation that Lawrence had been among them the entire time, had probably watched them searching with full knowledge that their efforts were futile, felt like a violation that reached back across the decades to reframe memories she had carried for most of her life. The forensic analysis of Lawrence's journal revealed details that investigators found both helpful and disturbing in equal measure. Handwriting experts confirmed beyond any doubt that the entries were written by Lawrence, comparing them to samples from business records, personal letters, and other documents spanning his lifetime. The journal itself was an expensive leather-bound book, the kind someone might receive as a gift or purchase for recording important memories. That Lawrence had used such a book to document his crimes struck many observers as particularly chilling, as if he had viewed his horrible actions as worthy of being preserved in a quality volume, rather than scrawled in a cheap notebook. The entries in the journal extended far beyond just the day of Evelyn's disappearance. Lawrence had written extensively about his life, his thoughts, his justifications for what he had done. Some entries showed genuine remorse and self-loathing, passages where Lawrence questioned what was wrong with him, why he had urges that he knew were evil, how he could live with himself after what he had done. Other entries were more clinical and detached, describing his planning and execution of the crime as if he were writing a technical manual. Still other passages revealed a disturbing pride in his ability to deceive everyone around him, a sense of superiority over the investigators who had questioned him and never suspected the truth. One particularly chilling entry, written approximately 3 years after Evelyn's death, discussed Lawrence's attendance at the community gathering held to mark the anniversary of her disappearance. He described watching Robert and Patricia Conway, noting how grief had aged them, how the loss of their daughter had fundamentally changed who they were as people. Lawrence wrote about feeling a strange connection to them, as if he was the only person who truly understood their pain because he was the one who had caused it. The passage revealed a narcissistic personality that viewed even the suffering he had inflicted as somehow creating a special bond between him and his victims' families. Psychological profilers who analyzed the journal concluded that Lawrence exhibited characteristics consistent with antisocial personality disorder, combined with predatory sexual behavior directed at children. However, they noted that he also showed an unusual degree of what might be termed compartmentalization, an ability to maintain his crimes in one mental space while genuinely participating in normal community life in another. This wasn't uncommon among serial offenders who managed to avoid detection for extended periods, but the degree to which Lawrence had maintained his double life was remarkable. He had attended church regularly, contributed to local charities, helped neighbors with various tasks, all while carrying the secret of what he had done to Evelyn Conway. The journal also contained unsettling passages about Lawrence's life after his wife's death in 1970. He wrote about how her illness and passing had affected him deeply, plunging him into a depression that he struggled to manage. Some entries suggested that his wife had been a stabilizing influence in his life, that whatever dark urges he harbored had been kept in check during their marriage. After her death, Lawrence described feeling unmoored and alone, no longer having anyone to be good for, no longer having the structure and companionship that had helped him maintain control. This was not an excuse for his actions, the profilers emphasized, but it provided context for understanding the timing of his crime against Evelyn. There were also entries discussing other children Lawrence had observed over the years, descriptions that made investigators' blood run cold as they read them. He wrote about seeing children at the beach, in town, at community events, describing them in ways that revealed his inappropriate attraction. However, investigators found no evidence that Lawrence had acted on these urges beyond the single documented case of Evelyn Conway. Extensive cross-referencing with other unsolved cases from the region and time period turned up no definitive links, though several cases remained under review. The working theory was that Evelyn had been Lawrence's only victim, that the circumstances of his wife's recent death, his isolation, and whatever opportunity Evelyn's presence at the beach that day had provided had combined to create a perfect storm that led to tragedy. Derek Cobb's life in the aftermath of his discovery followed a trajectory he never could have anticipated. Beyond the immediate shock and trauma of learning what his grandfather had done, Derek found himself becoming an unexpected advocate for victims' families and cold case investigation. He gave several interviews, always carefully vetted through his attorney, where he discussed the importance of coming forward with evidence even when it implicated loved ones. He emphasized that while he had loved his grandfather, that love could not and should not protect Lawrence from accountability for his actions. Derek spoke about the conflict he felt between his childhood memories of fishing trips and life lessons learned at Lawrence's knee, and the horrifying reality of what his grandfather had been capable of doing. The decision to speak publicly was not easy for Derek. He received hate mail and online harassment from people who felt he should have destroyed the evidence to protect his family's name. Others criticized him for what they perceived as attempting to profit from tragedy, though Derek never accepted payment for any interviews and donated speaking fees from his advocacy work to organizations supporting families of missing children. He also faced suspicion from conspiracy theorists who speculated that Derek must have known something earlier, that perhaps his grandfather had confessed before death, and Derek had only come forward when he thought the hidden evidence might be discovered by someone else. These accusations were baseless and hurtful, adding to the emotional burden Derek already carried. Through therapy and support from his wife Rachel and their 2 young children, Derek gradually found a way to process his complicated feelings about the situation. His therapist helped him understand that loving someone who turned out to have done terrible things did not make him complicit in those actions, that the grandfather he remembered was both real and incomplete, a partial picture of a complex person who had hidden his darkest aspects from view. Derek came to accept that he could mourn the loss of his relationship with Lawrence while also acknowledging the justice in the truth being revealed. It was a difficult balance to maintain, but Derek worked hard to find peace with the situation. The marine mechanic shop where Derek worked was initially supportive after the story broke, but the constant media attention and unwanted publicity eventually led Derek to make the difficult decision to resign. He couldn't do his job effectively when journalists were calling the shop constantly and customers were either treating him like a celebrity or avoiding him because of his association with the case. Derek eventually relocated his family to a different part of Maine, seeking a fresh start in a community where the Cobb name didn't carry the same baggage. He found work with a boat repair company in Bar Harbor, and while some people there knew about his connection to the Evelyn Conway case, the story had less immediate resonance in a community further removed from Pemaquid Point. Rachel Cobb, Derek's wife, found herself thrust into an uncomfortable spotlight as well. As a kindergarten teacher, she was particularly disturbed by the nature of Lawrence's crime. She had brought their children to visit Lawrence numerous times over the years, had left them in his care on occasions when she and Derek needed a babysitter. The knowledge that Lawrence had been capable of harming a child while presenting himself as a loving grandfather created a deep sense of betrayal and fear. Rachel underwent her own therapy to process these feelings, working through the guilt of not having somehow sensed danger, even though rationally she knew there was no way she could have known. She also had to help their children, ages 7 and 9, understand what had happened in age-appropriate terms, explaining why they couldn't see great-grandpa Lawrence anymore, and why people were sometimes asking them questions about their family. The Maine State Police conducted an exhaustive review of Lawrence's activities throughout his life, attempting to establish a complete timeline of his movements and opportunities. They interviewed dozens of people who had known him at various stages, from childhood friends who remembered him in school to fellow fishermen who had worked alongside him for decades. The picture that emerged was of a man who had been largely unremarkable for most of his life. Someone who did his job competently, maintained cordial relationships with neighbors, and participated in community life without standing out in any particular way. There were no reports of inappropriate behavior around children, no warning signs that anyone could identify with the benefit of hindsight. This was precisely what made Lawrence so dangerous, his ability to blend in perfectly and never attract suspicion. Investigators did discover that Lawrence had taken several unexplained trips in the months leading up to Evelyn's disappearance. His fishing logs showed gaps where he had claimed to be working but had not documented any catches. These trips could have been innocent, days when the fishing was poor and he had nothing to record, or they could have been reconnaissance missions where Lawrence was scoping out the isolated island where he would eventually take Evelyn. The island, which locals knew as Barren Ledge, was indeed as remote and inhospitable as Lawrence had described in his journal. The state police team that searched there found it difficult to access and navigate, with sharp rocks and dangerous drop-offs that made every step treacherous. It was easy to understand why no one had thought to search there during the original investigation. The island appeared to be nothing but bare rock with no shelter or resources that would attract a lost child or a criminal seeking a hiding place. The recovery of Evelyn's remains from Barren Ledge was handled with extraordinary care and respect. The forensic anthropology team worked slowly and methodically, documenting everything and ensuring that every fragment was recovered. The skeletal remains were remarkably well preserved given the 5-decade time span, protected by the rock crevice where Lawrence had left them. Along with the bones, investigators found small artifacts that further confirmed the location, remnants of the pink swimsuit Evelyn had been wearing, tiny fragments that had been protected from the elements by their position deep in the rocks. These items were processed as evidence but were eventually returned to Robert Conway along with Evelyn's remains, allowing him to bury his daughter with all that remained of her earthly presence. The funeral service for Evelyn drew an unexpectedly large crowd. Beyond family members and old friends of the Conways, there were people who had been involved in the original search, law enforcement officers who had worked the case over the years, and even some who had no personal connection but felt compelled to pay respects to a little girl whose story had touched something deep in their hearts. The service was both sad and strangely hopeful. Sad for the life that had been cut short, but hopeful in the knowledge that Evelyn had finally been found and could be laid to rest with dignity. Reverend Hastings spoke about the importance of truth and justice, about how evil could not ultimately prevail when good people refused to give up seeking answers. He mentioned Derek Cobb by name, thanking him for his courage in coming forward with evidence that must have been devastating to discover. Robert Conway, frail but determined, spoke briefly at the service. His voice shook as he thanked everyone who had never stopped caring about Evelyn, who had kept her memory alive through the decades of not knowing. He spoke about Patricia, about how she had never given up hope even as the years turned into decades, how she had kept Evelyn's room unchanged and had talked to their daughter's photograph every night before bed. Robert expressed gratitude for finally knowing what happened, even though the truth was terrible beyond words. He said that he could now join Patricia and Evelyn at peace, knowing that the mystery had been solved and that Lawrence Cobb's crimes had been exposed to the world. There was not a dry eye in the church as Robert slowly made his way back to his seat, supported by family members on either side. The media coverage of Evelyn's funeral was respectful and restrained, with most outlets honoring the family's request for privacy during the service itself. Photographs were taken from a distance, showing the small white casket being carried from the church and the long line of mourners following it to the cemetery. The image that appeared most frequently in news coverage was of Robert Conway standing beside the grave, one hand resting on the casket, his head bowed in prayer or contemplation. It was a powerful photograph that captured the culmination of a 51-year journey from anguished uncertainty to painful closure. In the months following Evelyn's burial, several organizations used her case as a catalyst for improving cold case investigations and family support services. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children developed new protocols based on lessons learned from the Conway case, emphasizing the importance of preserving evidence indefinitely and periodically reviewing cold cases with fresh eyes and new technology. They pointed out that if Derek Cobb had not found the hidden compartment, if Lawrence had disposed of the evidence at any point, the case might never have been solved. This highlighted the need for thorough searches of suspects' properties and possessions, even when there might not be probable cause for a warrant at the time. The Maine legislature passed a bill known as Evelyn's Law, which allocated additional funding for cold case investigations and required law enforcement agencies to maintain comprehensive databases of unsolved missing person cases. The law also mandated periodic reviews of these cases, ensuring that they would be re-examined at regular intervals rather than simply gathering dust in file cabinets. Advocates for the legislation argued that every unsolved case represented a family in pain, people who deserved answers and justice regardless of how much time had passed. Robert Conway lived long enough to see the bill signed into law, and he sent a letter to the governor expressing his gratitude for this positive outcome emerging from his family's tragedy. The psychological impact on Pemaquid Point continued to reverberate through the community for years after the case was solved. Property values near Lawrence's former home declined as potential buyers were reluctant to live in a house associated with such terrible crimes, even though Lawrence had not committed them there. The current owners, a young couple who had purchased the property 5 years before the truth came out, eventually sold at a significant loss and moved to another town. They reported feeling uncomfortable in their own home after learning about Lawrence's past, feeling as if the walls themselves were somehow contaminated by his presence. Lighthouse Beach saw a brief surge in what could only be called dark tourism, people visiting the site not for its natural beauty or historical significance, but because it was where Evelyn Conway had disappeared. Local authorities had to install additional signs and increase patrols to prevent people from disturbing the area or taking inappropriate photographs. Over time, this morbid curiosity faded, and the beach returned to being primarily a destination for families and nature lovers. However, the memorial plaque for Evelyn remained, and it was not uncommon to see flowers or small toys left there by visitors who wanted to honor her memory. The true crime community's fascination with the Evelyn Conway case generated numerous podcasts, YouTube videos, and online forums dedicated to analyzing every aspect of the story. Some of this content was thoughtful and respectful, produced by people genuinely interested in understanding the case and honoring Evelyn's memory. Other content was more exploitative, focusing on sensational details and speculation rather than the human tragedy at the heart of the story. Derek Cobb found himself having to issue cease and desist orders to several content creators who used his name and family photos without permission, including some who suggested ridiculous theories about Derek's supposed prior knowledge of his grandfather's crimes. Detective Sarah Rodriguez became the public face of the investigation in many ways, giving interviews and presentations about the case at law enforcement conferences around the country. She emphasized several key lessons that she believed other investigators should take from the Conway case. First, the importance of preserving all evidence from cold cases, even items that might seem insignificant at the time, because advances in forensic technology could make them valuable decades later. Second, the need to maintain detailed records and documentation, as the original investigation files from 1973 had been crucial in verifying Derek's discovery and understanding the full context of the case. Third, the value of community relationships and trust, which had led Derek to come forward rather than concealing what he had found. Rodriguez also spoke about the emotional toll that cold cases take on investigators. She described lying awake at night thinking about Evelyn, about Robert Conway waiting for answers, about all the unsolved cases on her desk that represented families in pain. The resolution of Evelyn's case had been personally meaningful to Rodriguez, who had young daughters of her own, and could not imagine the agony of not knowing what happened to a child. She used the case as motivation to work harder on other cold cases, to never give up searching for answers, and to always remember that behind every case file was a real person who deserved justice and a family who deserved closure. The FBI's review of other cold cases for potential links to Lawrence Cobb continued for over a year, with agents examining dozens of unsolved disappearances and assaults from Maine and surrounding states during the time period when Lawrence had been active. They paid particular attention to cases involving children near coastal areas, places where Lawrence would have had access through his fishing activities. While no definitive connections were established, several cases remained open and under investigation. The FBI was candid about the difficulties of this process, noting that without concrete evidence like the journal and photographs Derek had discovered, it was nearly impossible to prove or disprove Lawrence's involvement in other crimes. One case that drew particular scrutiny was the disappearance of 7-year-old Marcus Henderson, who had vanished from a beach in Rockland, Maine, in July 1976, almost exactly 3 years after Evelyn. There were superficial similarities: a child disappearing during a family beach outing, no witnesses to the actual abduction, and an intensive search that turned up nothing. However, the differences were significant as well. Marcus was older than Evelyn, the circumstances of his disappearance were different, and there was a suspect in that case who had eventually been ruled out but remained a person of interest. Investigators looked for any evidence that Lawrence had been in Rockland on the day Marcus disappeared, checking his fishing logs and interviewing people who might remember seeing him, but they found nothing conclusive. The Marcus Henderson case remained unsolved, another family left without answers. A reminder that not every mystery has a neat resolution. The town of Pemaquid Point eventually created a small museum exhibit about the Evelyn Conway case, housed in the Historical Society building on Main Street. The exhibit was carefully curated to balance public interest in the case with respect for the victims and their families. It included photographs of Evelyn from before her disappearance, information about the original investigation, and details about how the case was ultimately solved. Notably absent from the exhibit were any photographs of Lawrence Cobb or details about his confession that would seem to glorify or sensationalize his crimes. The focus was firmly on Evelyn, on remembering her as a real child who had lived and been loved, not just as a victim defined by her tragic end. The exhibit also included a section on child safety, with information about how parents could protect their children and what to do if a child went missing. This was controversial with some community members who felt it implied that the Conways had somehow been negligent, which was absolutely not the case. The Historical Society added clarification text explaining that the Conways had been attentive, loving parents and that Lawrence Cobb had been a sophisticated predator who had deliberately created an opportunity to commit his crime. The safety information was intended to educate and empower, not to assign blame to innocent families who had been victimized by criminals. Years after the case was solved, researchers studying criminal psychology and cold case investigations continued to find new insights in the Evelyn Conway case. Academic papers were published analyzing various aspects of the crime, from Lawrence's ability to maintain his secret for 5 decades to the psychological factors that might have motivated Derek to immediately contact police rather than concealing his discovery. The case became a teaching tool in criminal justice programs, used to illustrate principles of evidence preservation, interview techniques, victimology, and the importance of never closing the book on unsolved crimes. One particularly interesting study focused on the hidden compartment in the Patricia Rose, examining what motivated criminals to keep trophies and evidence of their crimes. The researchers noted that while many serial offenders kept souvenirs, the degree of care Lawrence had taken to preserve his evidence was unusual. The waterproof container, the hidden compartment built into the boat's structure, the quality of the journal he had used all suggested someone who viewed this evidence as valuable and important enough to protect carefully. The study theorized that for Lawrence, these items served multiple psychological functions. They allowed him to relive the crime, they provided proof of his successful deception, and perhaps on some unconscious level, they represented a need for his actions to eventually be acknowledged and understood. The boat itself, the Patricia Rose, was eventually destroyed. Derek had sold it to a salvage company, and after the hidden compartment and all its contents had been thoroughly documented and removed, the boat was dismantled. This was done partly for practical reasons. Nobody wanted to purchase or use a boat so intimately associated with such horrible crimes, but also as a symbolic gesture. The destruction of the boat felt like a way of ensuring that Lawrence's carefully preserved secret compartment would never serve as a shrine or attraction for the morbidly curious. The boat's name, ironically, had been chosen by Lawrence to honor his late wife, yet another layer of deception as he used something sacred to him as a hiding place for evidence of his darkest deeds. The Conway family line ended with Robert's death in November 2024. He and Patricia had been only children themselves, and Evelyn had been their sole offspring. The small cottage on Spruce Lane, where they had lived when Evelyn disappeared, was sold by a distant cousin who inherited Robert's estate, and the new owners were apparently unaware of or unconcerned by the property's connection to the famous case. The family's possessions were distributed or donated, with personal items related to Evelyn being given to the Historical Society for their archives. These included her baby book, photographs from her short life, the birthday cards she had received just weeks before her death, poignant reminders of the little girl who had existed beyond her role as a victim in a notorious crime. The resolution of the Evelyn Conway case did provide a form of healing for many people who had been touched by the tragedy, but it also served as a sobering reminder of how much pain one person's evil choices could inflict on an entire community. The ripples from the August day in 1973 extended outward through space and time, affecting not just the immediate Conway family, but friends, neighbors, investigators, volunteers, and eventually even people who had never known any of the principals but felt connected to the story through media coverage and public interest. It was a testament to how interconnected human lives are, how tragedy in one family can become shared grief for a community, and how the search for truth and justice resonates with fundamental human values that transcend individual circumstances. In the final analysis, the Evelyn Marie Conway case stands as both a tragedy and a testament to the enduring human need for truth. A 5-year-old girl's life was cut short by a trusted member of her community, a man who hid his true nature so successfully that he lived another 50 years without facing consequences for his actions. But ultimately, the truth did emerge, carried into the light by a grandson who chose moral courage over family loyalty, who decided that justice for Evelyn mattered more than protecting his grandfather's reputation. The case reminds us that evil can hide in plain sight, that we must remain vigilant while also not becoming paralyzed by suspicion, and that the pursuit of truth and justice is a responsibility that belongs to all of us, not just to law enforcement or government agencies. Evelyn deserved to grow up, to go to school, to make friends, to experience all the joys and challenges of life. She deserved to become whoever she might have been, to pursue dreams and passions, to love and be loved. Lawrence Cobb stole all of that from her, and in doing so, he inflicted permanent damage on her parents, on the community of Pemaquid Point, and on everyone who searched for her and mourned her absence for 51 years. But while Lawrence succeeded in ending Evelyn's life and hiding his crime for decades, he failed in keeping the truth buried forever. The evidence he so carefully preserved became his confession, his handwritten words, his ultimate undoing. And so, Evelyn Conway, who vanished from Lighthouse Beach on that August morning in 1973, finally came home, finally received justice, and finally was able to rest in peace beside her mother. Remembered not just as a victim, but as a beloved daughter whose loss left a permanent mark on all who knew her story.